The water doesn't disappear on its own. Someone has to let it go, I said, staring at the cracked mud where my dock used to kiss the lake. The smell of damp earth and algae hanging thick in the early morning air. Wrong somehow, like the lake itself was holding its breath. Yesterday, this place was alive. Boats rocking gently, water slapping against wood, sunlight dancing across ripples. But now the surface had dropped nearly 3 feet overnight, leaving the brand-new HOA sign nailed crooked. Into my dock looking like a joke no one wanted to admit. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and that dock they just claimed as community property? My grandfather built it with his own hands back in 1978, every plank measured twice, every nail driven like it mattered, because to him, this lake wasn't just scenery, it was survival. I grew up barefoot on that wood, the grain worn smooth under my feet, learning how water moves, how it listens, how it waits. But Margaret Whitmore didn't care about any of that when she showed up last week in her white SUV, clipboard in hand, perfume cutting through the scent of lake water like something artificial, trying too hard to belong. She smiled when she told me the dock was now under HOA jurisdiction, said it slow like she was explaining something obvious, like ownership was just a suggestion. I remember the sound of her heels tapping against the boards as she walked out over the water, claiming it with every step, already talking about community access and shared enjoyment, already planning weekend events like she'd built the thing herself. I didn't argue then, not out loud, because arguing with someone like Margaret is like shouting into wind. You don't change direction, you just waste breath. Instead, I watched, hands in my pockets, feeling the cool morning air against my skin, listening to the distant hum of generators and the low chatter of our HOA crew installing signs, measuring boundaries that never belonged to them. They painted over my dock that afternoon, fresh white lettering declaring it open to all residents. The smell of paint still sharp when they started tying boats to it, laughing, drinking, acting like they'd always owned this view. And when I stepped onto the wood that night, just to remind myself it was still real, one of her hired security guys actually told me to leave, said I needed authorization to be there, said it like it made sense. I can still hear the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked away, slow, steady, like I was giving something up. But inside, something else was clicking into place, because what Margaret didn't know, what none of them bothered to check, was that this lake doesn't just sit here by accident. It feeds from a controlled inlet upstream, a system of gates and channels buried in old county records and older family history, something my grandfather designed with engineers who understood that water isn't just a feature, it's leverage. I drove out there before sunrise, the road quiet, tires humming over pavement as the sky shifted from black to that pale blue that makes everything feel temporary. And when I stepped out, the air smelled cleaner, colder, like it knew what was coming. The metal wheel on the control gate was exactly where I left it years ago, worn smooth from use, cold under my fingers, and for a second, I just stood there, listening to the faint rush of water behind it, steady, patient. Then I turned it, slow at first, feeling the resistance give, the mechanism groaning like it hadn't been touched in decades, and as the flow redirected, as the water began to lower inch by inch, I realized something Margaret never would. Owning the dock means nothing if you don't control what touches it. By the time the sun cleared the trees, their perfect little community feature was already changing, the water pulling back like a tide they couldn't understand. And as I looked out across that shrinking shoreline, I knew this was just the beginning. I did not go back home after turning that valve, not right away, because I wanted to hear it, the low, steady shift in pressure as water rerouted through channels no one had thought about in decades. The kind of sound you only notice when you know exactly what you're listening for. It was subtle, almost polite, like the lake itself was adjusting its posture, pulling its weight back inch by inch, and I stood there, with my hands resting on that cold steel wheel, feeling the vibration travel up through my arms, grounding me in something older than any HOA rulebook. By the time I drove back down toward the shoreline, the morning sun had climbed just high enough to expose the difference. Not dramatic yet, but undeniable. A darker ring forming along the edge where water used to be, mud beginning to show through like a secret that could not stay buried. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No gentle slapping of water against the dock. No soft creak of ropes pulling against cleats. just the dry tick of wood expanding under heat and the distant murmur of confused voices. Margaret was already there, of course, standing at the end of the dock with her phone in hand, her posture stiff, heels planted carefully now that the boards were no longer hovering above water, but hanging awkwardly above exposed ground. I could hear her voice before I got close, sharp and controlled, asking someone on the phone why the water level had dropped. Like it was a service interruption she could file a complaint about. A couple of her HOA board members stood nearby, arms crossed, staring out at the lake like it had personally betrayed them, their expensive sunglasses reflecting a shoreline that looked very different from the one they had celebrated just the day before. One of the residents tried to push his small fishing boat off the edge of the dock, expecting that familiar glide into water, but instead the hull scraped against mud with a dull, dragging sound that made everyone wince. I kept my pace steady as I walked down the gravel path, each step crunching louder than usual in the dry air, and when Margaret finally noticed me, her expression shifted from irritation to something tighter, something more calculated. She lowered her phone slowly, eyes narrowing just enough to show she was connecting dots she did not fully understand yet. "Ethan," she said, drawing out my name like it was. Part accusation, part demand, as if I owed her an explanation for something she had already decided was mine to fix. I stopped a few feet from the base of the dock, looking up at the sign they had installed, the fresh paint already starting to look out of place against the drying wood. And for a moment I let the silence sit between us, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that forces people to reveal themselves. The air smelled different now, less like open water and more like exposed earth, a faint mineral scent that clung to the back of your throat. Margaret took a step closer, careful with her footing, and gestured toward the receding lake with a controlled sweep of her hand, asking what was going on. Here, her voice still polished, but carrying an edge she could not quite hide. I glanced past her to the line where water had been just hours ago, then back to her, noticing the small details she probably thought were invisible, the way her grip tightened on her phone, the way her shoulders held just a little too rigid, like she was bracing for something she could not name. "You ever notice how quiet it gets when something important changes?" I said, keeping my tone even, almost conversational, like we were discussing the weather instead of the foundation of everything she thought she controlled. She did not answer that, just watched me, waiting, expecting a confession or an apology, or maybe just a simple explanation she could file away and solve with a meeting and a vote. Behind her, one of the board members muttered something about drought. Another mentioned checking with the county. Their voices overlapping in that anxious way people get when control starts slipping through their fingers. I let them talk for a few seconds, let the uncertainty build, because this was the part they always miss, the moment before understanding, when everything still feels reversible. Then I looked back at Margaret and said, real calm, "That lakes like this do not just drop overnight without a reason. And the thing about reasons is they usually start somewhere upstream." Her eyes flicked for just a second, not much, but enough. A quick calculation happening behind that practice smile, and in that moment, I knew she was beginning to realize that this was not a maintenance issue, not a paperwork problem, not something she could fix with a notice or a fine. This was something else entirely, something tied to land and design and decisions made long before she ever showed up with her clipboard. The dock creaked under her weight as she shifted slightly. And for the first time since I'd met her, she did not look like she owned the ground she was standing on, because deep down, she was starting to understand a simple truth that no HOA meeting could change, that the value of what she claimed depended on something she did not control, and that something was already moving. Margaret did not respond right away, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because people like her always have an answer ready unless something truly unexpected hits them. The breeze picked up slightly, carrying that dry, earthy smell across the exposed shoreline, and I watched as one of the HOA residents stepped off the dock and sank half an inch into the soft mud, pulling his shoe free with a wet, uncomfortable sound that made him curse under his breath. The lake kept retreating, slow enough to seem natural if you did not know better, but steady enough that every minute changed the picture. The waterline pulling back another few inches, revealing rocks and debris that had not seen sunlight in years. Margaret turned fully toward me now, her posture shifting from confident authority to controlled concern, the kind she used when something threatened her version of order. "This is unacceptable," she said, her voice firm but thinner than before, as if saying it out. Loud might force reality to comply. "We have residents who rely on this lake. This is community property now." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, the way she kept framing everything as if saying the words made them true. "Community property," she repeated, emphasizing each syllable like she was reading from a rulebook no one else had seen. Behind her, someone tried to adjust a boat tied to the dock, but the rope hung slack now. The vessel tilted awkwardly against the mud, no longer floating but resting, stranded in a way that looked temporary until you realized it was not. I took a slow breath, tasting the dryness in the air, and let my eyes move past her again to the far side of the lake, where the inlet disappeared behind a line of trees, invisible to anyone who had not spent years walking that land. "You ever read the original land surveys for this place?" I asked, keeping my tone level, almost casual, like I was bringing up an interesting fact at a dinner table instead of dismantling her authority piece by piece. She frowned slightly, the question clearly not what she expected, and shook her head just enough to show she did not see the relevance. Of course not, she said, because to her, ownership started the day paperwork crossed her desk, not decades before. "That is where most people get it wrong," I continued, letting the words come slow, measured, because this was not about rushing. It was about letting understanding settle in whether she wanted it to or not. "This lake is not natural," I said, nodding toward the shrinking waterline. "It is managed, engineer controlled." I could see the shift then, subtle but real, the way her eyes flicked again toward the water, then back to me, recalculating. "Controlled by who?" she asked, and there was the question that mattered, the one she should have asked before she ever set foot on that dock with her clipboard and her assumptions. The board members went quiet behind her, their earlier muttering fading as they leaned in just slightly, waiting for the answer like it might fix everything if it came out simple enough. I let a second pass, then another, just enough to stretch the moment, to make them feel the gap between what they thought they knew and what was actually true. The wind shifted again, rattling the sign they had bolted into my dock, the metal bracket giving a small, hollow clink that echoed more than it should have in the growing stillness. I finally looked directly at her and said, "The same people who have always controlled it," which did not satisfy her at all, and that was the point. Margaret's jaw tightened just slightly, her patience thinning as control slipped further from her reach, and she took a step closer, careful again with her footing, like the ground itself was no longer something she trusted. "You need to fix this," she said, dropping the polished tone, now letting a hint of command slip through, as if I were a contractor she could hire and dismiss. "The problem with commands is they only work when the other person recognizes your authority, and I did not." I glanced back toward the waterline, noting how far it had already moved, calculating without thinking, years of training, turning observation into instinct. And I knew by evening the difference would be impossible to ignore. "Fix is an interesting word," I said quietly, because from where I stand, nothing is broken. That landed exactly how I expected. Confusion first, then irritation, then that creeping realization that she was not dealing with a situation she could label and resolve. The dock creaked again as someone shifted behind her, and I could feel the attention of everyone there focusing in, waiting for something to make sense. Margaret opened her mouth like she was about to push back harder, but paused, just for a fraction of a second, and in that pause I saw it, the beginning of understanding. Not complete yet, not fully formed, but enough to unsettle her. The lake kept pulling away, inch by inch, quiet, patient, inevitable. And standing there watching it happen, I knew she was starting to realize that whatever control she thought she had claimed ended at the edge of something much bigger, something she had never even thought to question until now. By late afternoon, the lake had dropped another foot, enough that what used to be gentle shoreline now stretched out like a wide, uneven scar, cracked mud baking under the sun and giving off that dry, mineral smell that sticks in your throat. The dock sat there awkward and exposed, its shadow no longer dancing on water, but falling hard and sharp across dirt, that had not seen daylight in decades. I could hear the difference before I even got close again. No soft waves, no hollow echo under the boards, just the dull creak of wood settling into stillness and the occasional scrape of someone's shoes slipping on mud they were not prepared for. Margaret had changed positions, no longer standing at the far end like she owned the view, but closer to the middle now, surrounded by two board members and a man in a polo shirt holding a tablet, probably someone she called in to make sense of what she could not control. Their voices carried across the open space, sharper now, less confident, questions stacking on top of each other without answers. I stayed back at first, leaning against the rough bark of a tree just off the path, watching how they moved, how uncertainty spread through them like something contagious. One of the residents tried again with his boat, pushing harder this time, the hull dragging a few feet before stopping completely, tilted at an angle that made it obvious it was not going anywhere. The sound was wrong, a long, dry scrape that echoed more than it should have, and he stepped back shaking his head, wiping mud off his hands onto his shorts. Margaret turned when she saw me, like she had been waiting for that exact moment, her expression tighter now, the edges of control starting to fray. "This has gone too far," she said, voice raised just enough to carry, no longer pretending. "This was a minor issue. You're interfering with a shared resource." I pushed off the tree and walked closer, gravel crunching under my boots, the rhythm steady, unhurried because rushing would have meant I was reacting, and I was not. "Interfering implies something is not working the way it is supposed to," I replied, stopping a few feet from the dock, looking out over the retreating waterline that now sat several yards farther than it had that morning. The man with the tablet cleared his throat and stepped forward, talking about water levels, about possible upstream issues, about needing to contact county officials, his words careful but uncertain, like he was building a case without knowing the full story. Margaret cut him off with a small gesture, her focus locked back on me, because at this point she knew the answer was standing right in front of her, whether she liked it or not. "You need to restore this immediately," she said, and there was again that assumption that authority could solve anything if applied hard enough. I let a small pause stretch between us, feeling the heat of the sun on my shoulders, the dry air pulling moisture from everything it touched, including the confidence in her voice. "You keep using that word like this is something broken," I said, glancing briefly at the exposed shoreline where old stones and submerged branches now sat in plain view. Evidence of how much had changed in just a few hours. But this system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Confusion flickered across her face, followed quickly by irritation, because design implies intent. And intent means someone made a choice. Behind her, one of the board members whispered. Something about liability, about property values, about how this could not continue. Their voices low but urgent, the tone shifting from control to concern. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, carrying dust instead of moisture, and the sign on the dock rattled slightly, that hollow metallic sound cutting through the conversation like a reminder that what they claimed was starting to lose meaning. Margaret stepped down off the dock carefully, her heels sinking slightly into the softer ground near the edge, and she adjusted her stance quickly, pretending it had not happened, but I saw it, the moment where the environment pushed back just enough to break her rhythm. She stood closer to me now, not towering over the situation anymore, but meeting it at ground level, and her voice dropped just a fraction, less public, more direct. "What do you want?" she asked, and that question landed differently, because it was the first honest one she had asked all day. I looked past her again, tracing the line where water used to be, calculating how much farther it could go before the entire lake changed character, and I knew we were not even halfway there yet. "It is not about what I want," I said quietly, bringing my gaze back to hers. "It is about what was already in place long before you decided to put your name on it." She held my gaze, searching for leverage, for a detail she could use, but there was nothing there she recognized, nothing that fit into her usual playbook. The lake kept pulling back, steady, patient, revealing more with every passing minute, and standing there in the growing silence, it became clear to everyone watching that whatever authority they thought they had claimed stopped exactly where something older, something built into the land itself, had already decided otherwise. By the time the sun started dropping toward the treeline, the lake had lost nearly half its depth along the shoreline, and what used to feel like open water now looked like a slow retreat, a quiet withdrawal that made every step on that dock feel misplaced. The air had changed completely, heavier with the scent of exposed sediment and drying algae, and every breath carried a faint grit that reminded you something fundamental had shifted. Margaret was no longer trying to command the situation out loud, but I could see it in the way she moved, quicker now, tighter, pacing along the dock as she spoke in her phone, her voice low but urgent, repeating phrases like emergency review and immediate response, as if somewhere there was still a system she could activate that would override what was happening in front of her. The man with the tablet had stepped off to the side, tapping rapidly, checking data that did not match what his eyes were telling him, and every so often he would glance up at the shrinking waterline like it might suddenly reverse if he looked long enough. A few residents had gathered farther back now, standing on dry ground where water had been just hours ago, their voices quieter, less confident, the kind of tone people use when they realize they're not dealing with something they understand. I walked past them slowly, feeling the texture of the ground under my boots change from gravel to damp earth to cracked mud, each step telling a story of how fast things were shifting. And when I reached the edge of what used to be shoreline, I stopped and looked out across the lake, tracing the path the water had taken as it pulled away, knowing exactly where it was going and why. You can tell a lot about a place by what it hides under the surface, I said, not raising my voice, but knowing she would hear me anyway. Margaret turned again, sharper this time, her patience worn thin, and she stepped toward me with that same controlled intensity. But it was different now, less certain, like she was trying to reassemble control from pieces that did not fit anymore. "This is not a discussion," she said, her tone clipped. "You are affecting property values, access rights, community infrastructure, and I will not allow this to continue." I let that hang for a second, feeling the weight of her words against the reality unfolding around us, the dry wind brushing past, the distant sound of a boat hull settling deeper into mud, the quiet absence of water where it used to be. "Allow is a strong word," I replied, turning slightly so I could see both her and the line where the lake had receded another few inches since I last looked, because it suggests you have control over what happens next. The board members behind her shifted uncomfortably, one of them finally stepping forward and asking, more cautiously now, what exactly was causing the drop, his voice careful, like he was asking permission to understand. I met his gaze briefly, then looked back at Margaret, because this was her moment whether she realized it or not. "You keep calling it a lake," I said, "but it is really a reservoir, and reservoirs follow rules that do not change just because someone puts up a sign." That word landed differently. I could see it ripple through them, the way language reshapes understanding when it hits the right nerve. Reservoir means controlled, managed, dependent on inputs and outputs, and more importantly, it means someone designed it that way. Margaret's expression tightened again, but there was something new in it now, not just frustration, but calculation, like she was finally asking the right question in her head, even if she had not said it out loud yet. The man with the tablet looked up quickly, interest replacing confusion, and asked who controlled the inflow, his voice sharper now, more focused, because he understood exactly what that implied. I did not answer him directly, not yet, because the answer was already forming in Margaret's mind. And sometimes the most effective thing you can do is let someone arrive at the truth on their own. The wind pushed across the exposed lake bed, lifting small particles of dust into the air, and the sign on the dock rattled again, louder this time, like it was protesting its own irrelevance. Margaret looked past me, toward the far end of the lake where the inlet disappeared into trees she had probably never bothered to explore, and I watched the moment it clicked, the realization that control did not start where she stood, but somewhere beyond her reach. She turned back to me slowly, her voice lower now, stripped of the public tone she had been using all day, and asked one simple question: how far upstream? I held her gaze for a second, feeling the quiet settle in around us, the absence of water amplifying every small sound, every shift in posture, every breath. "Far enough," I said, "that what you're standing on is not the part that matters." The dock creaked behind her as someone shifted their weight, And in that moment, surrounded by dry earth where water used to be, it became clear that whatever control she thought she had claimed was built on something that could disappear 1 inch at a time. And we were only getting started. The sun dipped lower, and with it the last illusion of control slipped off that shoreline. Because now the lake was not just receding, it was exposing everything. Old tree stumps, rusted metal, forgotten debris sitting out in the open like evidence that had been waiting years to be seen. The air felt different again, drier, sharper, and every sound carried farther across that empty space. The hollow knock of wood against wood, the distant murmur of voices trying to stay calm, the faint whistle of wind moving where water used to slow it down. Margaret did not pace anymore. She stood still now, arms crossed tight against herself, eyes fixed somewhere between me and the far inlet like she was trying to map something she had never needed to understand before. The man with the tablet had stepped closer to her, speaking in low, urgent tones about inflow control points, about upstream management, about how this kind of drop does not happen without deliberate intervention. And I could see. The exact moment he realized he was not talking about a random fluctuation, but a system someone was actively managing. One of the board members pulled out his phone and started scrolling fast, probably digging through property records, searching for something that would give them leverage, but every second he spent looking was another inch of water gone. I walked along the edge where water had been that morning, my boots pressing into drying ground that cracked softly under pressure, the texture shifting with every step, and I could feel the lake's absence more than I could see it now, like a weight had been lifted but left something exposed underneath. Margaret finally broke the silence again, her voice lower than before, controlled but no longer confident, asking how long this would continue, not demanding anymore, just asking, and that shift mattered more than anything she had said all day. I stopped and looked out across the basin, tracing the lines in my head, calculating flow rates without thinking, years of training turning instinct into certainty, and I knew exactly how far it could go if I let it. Long enough, I said, that what you built your authority on stops working completely. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried the weight of someone realizing the ground rules had changed. Behind her, one of the residents tried to laugh it off, saying it would refill, that lakes always come back. But even he did not sound convinced, his voice thin against the wide, open silence where water used to echo. The man with the tablet stepped forward again, more direct this time, asking if I was controlling the inflow, asking it like he already knew the answer, but needed it said out loud. I did not rush to respond, because this was the moment where everything aligned, the facts, the space, the absence, and the truth sitting right there in front of all of them. You ever notice how something only feels permanent when you do not understand how it works? I said, letting my eyes move across the exposed lake bed, because once you see the system, you realize it was never fixed in place to begin with. Margaret looked at me then, really looked this time, not as a problem to solve or a resident to manage, but as the missing piece she had ignored. And I could see the shift settle in, the acceptance that whatever she thought she controlled ended somewhere far short of where this actually began. The wind picked up again, stronger now, pushing dust across the exposed ground, rattling the sign on the dock so hard it echoed across the empty basin, a hollow, metallic sound that felt out of place without water to absorb it. She stepped forward slowly, careful with every movement, and asked one final question, her voice steady but stripped of everything she had been hiding behind. What happens if it does not come back? I let that sit for a moment, feeling the quiet stretch out between us, the kind of silence that forces people to confront what they already know. And then I answered, calm and certain, that depends on who controls what feeds it. No one spoke after that. Not immediately, because the answer was already there in the exposed ground, in the stranded boats, in the dock hanging useless above dry earth. And in that stillness, it became clear that this was no longer about a dispute or a misunderstanding. It was about something much simpler and much harder to argue with, the fact that everything they claimed depended on something they had never owned in the first place. And now that truth was sitting out in the open for everyone to see. The sun was almost gone when the first real crack in their confidence showed. Not in words, but in movement, because people started leaving the dock quietly at first, stepping back on a ground that felt more stable even if it was not what they came for. The air had cooled slightly, but the dryness stayed, clinging to everything, and the lake, or what was left of it, stretched out in a wide, uneven basin that looked less like a feature and more like something unfinished. Margaret stayed where she was for a moment longer, standing at the edge of that dock that no longer reached water, her silhouette framed against a horizon that had shifted farther than she expected. And when she finally turned away, it was not with the sharp authority she carried earlier, but with a slower, more deliberate pace, like she was choosing each step instead of assuming it would hold. The board members followed her, voices low, controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath, words like liability and jurisdiction slipping into their conversation, replacing the earlier language of ownership and access. I walked a few yards parallel to them, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to catch the edges of what they were saying, because this was the part where the story changed, not out loud, but in how they started thinking. The man with the tablet was explaining something about water rights now, about upstream control, about how legal authority over a body of water often depends on the source, not the surface, and every sentence he spoke felt like it was peeling back a layer they had never considered. Margaret stopped walking when she heard that, just for a second, and turned slightly toward him, her posture tightening again, but this time it was not control, it was resistance, like she did not want the answer to go where it was heading. I could see in the way she held her shoulders, squared but not steady, like she was bracing against something she could not push back. I kept my eyes forward, watching the line where water used to sit, now a wide stretch of exposed ground that caught the last light of the day in a dull, uneven glow, and I knew by morning it would look even different again. One of the residents approached Margaret carefully, asking if there would be a fix, if the lake would be restored, his voice carrying that mix of concern and expectation people have when they believe someone else is responsible for maintaining their reality. Margaret gave him a quick answer, something about ongoing evaluation and coordination, but it sounded thinner now, like a placeholder instead of a plan. The man nodded, but he did not look reassured, and when he walked away, his steps were slower, more uncertain, like he was already adjusting to a new understanding. I moved closer to the dock again, stepping onto the wood, feeling how it no longer had that subtle give that comes from water supporting its edges. Now it felt rigid, disconnected, like a structure that had lost its purpose but not yet its shape. The boards creaked under my weight, louder than before, the sound carrying out across the open space and echoing back in a way that felt almost hollow. Margaret noticed and turned again, her eyes following me as I walked out a few feet and stopped, looking down at where the water used to meet the edge, now several yards away. "You knew," she said quietly, not accusing, not fully asking, just stating something she was finally allowing herself to believe. I did not turn right away, just let the question settle in the air between us, then nodded once, small control, because there was no reason to pretend otherwise. She took a few steps closer, careful again with her footing, and stopped, near the base of the dock, her gaze moving from me to the exposed lake bed and back again, trying to connect the pieces she had ignored before. "You could have said something," she added, and there was a trace of something new in her voice, not authority, not even frustration, but something closer to realization. I finally looked at her then, steady, calm, and said that I did, just not in the way she expected, because sometimes the clearest message is not spoken. It is shown. The wind moved through again, lighter now, carrying a faint chill that settled into the space where water used to moderate everything. And for a moment, no one spoke. The dock, the sign, the stranded boats, all of it sat there in quiet contradiction to what they thought they owned. And as the last light faded, it became clear that this was no longer about a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was about a shift in reality they could not ignore anymore, because the foundation of their control had been pulled back inch by inch, and there was nothing left beneath it to hold them up. Morning came with a different kind of silence, not the quiet of early light on water, but the stillness of something missing, like the lake had decided not to come back overnight. And when I stepped out onto the shoreline, the air carried that dry, chalky smell again, heavier now, settled and like it belonged. The waterline had pulled back even farther, at least another 10 yards, exposing more of the basin. deeper cracks forming in the mud, lines running in every direction like a map of pressure and time. The dock stood there unchanged, but completely different, suspended over nothing, its shadow stretching long across ground. That should have been reflecting light instead of absorbing it. I could hear voices before I saw them, sharper this time, less control, because people had slept on the problem and woken up without a solution. Margaret was already there, standing near the base of the dock, not on it anymore, her heels planted firmly on dry ground like she had learned something from yesterday, her posture straighter, but her expression tighter, like she had replaced confidence with determination. The man with the tablet was beside her again, but now he was not explaining, he was reporting, using words like confirmed inflow restriction and upstream control authority, his voice steady but edged with the kind of certainty that does not leave room for interpretation. One of the board members held a folder, flipping through printed documents, pages catching the morning breeze and snapping lightly, the sound crisp against the empty basin. I walked closer, feeling the ground firmer under my boots as it dried, each step quieter than yesterday, less resistance, more acceptance. And when Margaret saw me, she did not wait this time. We reviewed the records, she said, her voice measured, controlled, but stripped of that earlier assumption that she was setting the terms. And there was the shift fully formed now. She was no longer telling me what was happening. She was acknowledging it. I nodded once. Not as confirmation, but as recognition, because this was always where it was going to end. She continued, choosing her words carefully, saying that the inflow channel, the control structure, the original design, all of it tied back to land outside the HOA boundary, and more importantly, tied to ownership that had never been transferred, never been shared, never been part of what she claimed. The board members behind her were quiet now, no side comments, no quick solutions, just listening, because the answer was not something they could vote on. The man with the tablet added something about regulatory compliance, about how interfering with controlled water systems without authority could create liability far beyond property disputes. And I could see that word land harder than anything else he had said. Liability changes conversations. It shifts focus from control to consequence. Margaret held her ground, but I could see the tension in her hands, fingers tightening slightly against the folder she now held, her grip firm but not relaxed. "You reduced the water level," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. I did not interrupt her because she was finally saying it the right way. "Temporarily," I replied, letting the words settle, because that detail mattered more than anything else. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, because temporary means reversible, and reversible means negotiable. The wind moved across the basin again, lighter this morning, carrying the faint sound of something shifting far off where the remaining water pooled, a distant ripple that felt out of place against everything else. Margaret glanced toward it, then back at me, and asked what it would take to stabilize the level, her tone direct now, stripped of everything but purpose. I looked past her again across the exposed ground, tracing the line where the water could return if allowed. And for a moment I let the silence stretch, because this was the point where control changed hands without anyone needing to say it out loud. "It depends on how you define stability," I said, because for me, stability means the system works the way it was designed, without interference. She understood that immediately. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in adjustment. One of the board members stepped forward, asking if there was a path forward, his voice careful, like he was stepping onto uncertain ground. I met his gaze briefly, then looked back at Margaret because she was the one who needed to hear it. "There always is," I said, "but it starts with recognizing where control actually begins." The dock creaked softly behind her as the wood adjusted to the cooler air, the sound quieter now, less strained, like it had settled into its new reality. Margaret turned slightly, looking back at it, at the sign still hanging there, bold letters claiming something that no longer matched the ground beneath it. And when she faced me again, there was no trace of the tone she had started with the day before, only a measured awareness that what she thought she owned had been defined by something she never accounted for. And now, standing in the open basin of what used to be a lake, she was finally dealing with that truth on its terms instead of her own. By mid-morning, the basin had settled into something that no longer looked temporary, the kind of stillness that makes people stop expecting things to fix themselves, and the air carried that dry, sun-warmed scent of exposed earth like it had always been there. The dock stood quiet now. No footsteps, no voices claiming it, just what suspended over distance that used to be water, the sign hanging stiff and out of place, its bold lettering no longer matching reality. Margaret stood a few feet away. From me, not on the dock, not at the center of anything, just present, her posture composed but changed like she had recalibrated where she stood in all of this. The board members stayed back, giving space without being told, their earlier urgency replaced with something more careful, more aware. The man with the tablet closed his case slowly, like he understood his part was done, that the numbers had already said what needed to be said. I looked out across the exposed basin one more time, tracing the lines, the edges, the path the water would take if allowed, because this was never about draining it completely. It was about showing exactly where control began and where it ended. Margaret finally spoke, her voice steady, quieter than before but clear, saying that the HOA would be removing the signage, that any claims over the dock would be withdrawn pending proper review. Her words precise, deliberate, chosen with care, because now she understood that language mattered when it touched something real. I nodded once, not as approval, just acknowledgement, because this was not a negotiation I needed to win out loud. When the board member stepped forward, asking what would happen next, his tone respectful now, measured like he was asking instead of assuming, I took a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on my shoulders, the dryness in the air, the quiet that had replaced all the noise from before, and I said that the system would return to normal when it was left alone to function the way it was designed. Nothing more, nothing less. Margaret held my gaze for a moment, and there was no resistance there now, just understanding, the kind that settles in when there is nothing left to argue against. She turned then, giving a small nod to the others, and they began to move, not hurried, not scattered, just stepping back from something they had finally recognized as outside their control. I watched them go for a second, then turned back toward the lake, or what it had become, and in the distance I could already hear it, faint at first, the subtle shift of water being allowed to return, the quiet flow finding its path again, steady, patient, inevitable. It would take time, hours, maybe a day or two, but the basin would fill, the shoreline would soften. The dock would meet the water again, and everything would look the way they expected it to, except it would not feel the same. Not after this. I stepped onto the dock slowly, feeling the boards under my boots, the way they creaked softer now, like they remembered what they were meant for, and I walked out just far enough to stand